Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Givers, Doers, and Thinkers webinar from the Center for Civil Society. I'm Jack Fowler, Senior Fellow at the Center, and I think I'm the Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships at AmPhil, which is a mouthful. I host these Center webinars, and we're doing a series of them on America 250. The quincentennial is approaching, something to be celebrated except for those of you who prefer celebrating 1619, we're into celebrating 1776, some of us. Today's webinar is on religious freedom, civil society, and American exceptionalism on the 250th. And I'm very happy to have a couple of experts with me. I have two. I'm hoping the third will be showing up. The third is Rick Brookhiser, my former colleague from National Review magazine. I used to be the publisher at National Review. I'm still a contributing editor. And Rick has written many popular books on the founders, and he's actually done a very popular, came out last year, a popular documentary on free exercise. You can catch it on PBS. But I do have with me and us, and thank you all for joining, Garrett Snedeker, who's Garrett's a legal scholar. He is the legal scholar on this panel, and he's got serious chops in the area of religious liberty. He's the deputy director of the James Wilson Institute on Natural Rights and the American Founding, and he hosts the Anchoring Truths podcast. He's a graduate of the Antonin Scalia School at George Mason University, and he's written numerous publications, including First Things, Law and Liberty, etc. He also has, I think it's fair to say, he's the great privilege of being the right hand of the great Hadley Arkes. Would that be that's a good thing too?
Hadley is the talent. I'm the muscle.
Okay, Batman and Robin, something like that. But Garrett, I'm so happy you're here, and then also Pavlos Papadopoulos, who I've just met today, and I'm actually going to meet in person in a few days. He's the associate professor of humanities at Wyoming Catholic College in Landers, Wyoming. He's the faculty representative to the board there. He's been teaching at Wyoming Catholic since 2018. He's a graduate of St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. He writes about politics, culture, and education in various publications. First Things, American Mind, American Reformer. I just saw a piece by you, Pavlos, in American Reformer's terrific piece. The reason I'm going to be out there in a few days, we're recording here on September 16th, 2025, and this will be recorded and will be up on YouTube on the Center for Civil Society's page. Is I've always wanted to see tumbleweeds, and I'm going to go see them at Wyoming Catholic. I'm also going to be writing an article about this school, which is a Cardinal Newman guide school. It's authentically Catholic college. So Pavlos, welcome. Thank you for being here. So we have three major areas to talk about: the founding, the sense of civil society in America, especially as Tocqueville saw it 50 plus years after the founding. And then what is the state of religious liberty today? So we have religious liberty, American exceptionalism. Is America exceptional? Is religion part of America's exceptionalism? Is a vibrant civil society and voluntary associations, is this at the heart of what makes America exceptional? Maybe America isn't exceptional, but we'll ask the big brains here. So, but we'll go through this, and if you have questions that you want to pose to any of our two panelists, please, there's a little question thing at the bottom here, somewhere on this on Zoom. There's a question function, and they'll percolate up, and I'll ask them. So let me start, Pavlos. I'm gonna ask you to get us started here, and I want to know about the state of what is your view of the state of religiosity, religion, worship, faith in America at the time of the founding. Now, this will be a little bit of a long question, but you wrote recently in American Reformer that the founders exhibited their piety towards God. And there were references to God in the Declaration: Creator, Supreme Judge, Divine Providence. Were they there more so for show? to check a box, or were they deeply meaningful and integral not only to the founding document, but to the larger nation? Were they an expression of a prevailing view of the people and not just the delegates to the Continental Congress? So, what was the state of religiosity, faith, worship, etc., when America came to be formally as a nation in 1776?
Sure. Thank you, Jack, for having me in for that question. I think it was an integral statement of the people's religiosity and really essential to understand who the American people were at the time of the founding, before, during, and certainly afterwards for some time. I think a fair reading of the Declaration of Independence, you see that there are four very prominent references to God under different aspects from beginning to end of that document indicates this. There is a passing reference to God in the Articles of Confederation. There is a very indirect reference to God, maybe in the language of the blessings of liberty in the preamble to the Constitution. But the main action, I think, that we should look to in this period is the state constitutions. And when you turn to the state constitutions, you really see the insistence by the American people and their representatives on a public Christianity. It brings me, as a Catholic, it brings me no pleasure to point out, but I think we have to point out that it's an emphatically Protestant, or almost always an emphatically Protestant version of Christianity throughout the state constitutions, or most of them at this time. And I also think we have testimony from not only letters, but also outside observers that attest to this. So I'll say something about an outside observer. Edmund Burke gives his speech on conciliation with the colonies in March 1775, trying to tell the British to govern the Americans in a more gentle way, to give them a little bit more lead on the leash. And of course, his speech comes too late. Lexington and Concord happens before anyone could, if they wanted to, take his advice. But when he describes the character of the Americans leading into the Revolution, he talks about their fierce love of liberty, and he traces it back to 6 sources. And one of those sources is religiosity. One of those sources is specifically the Protestant religion. It's not the sole cause, but it is a major cause that Burke saw as contributing. I think also we could see the importance of religion in the documents, public and private, of John Adams. I love Adams, being from Massachusetts originally myself, so I have to cite him. Adams speaks in a letter to the Abbé de Mably, a French thinker who's trying to write a history of the American Revolution. He speaks of 4 institutions that formed the Americans to be capable of the American Revolution. And he says it's their towns, their churches, their schools, and their militia in the Massachusetts townships and in the New England townships that equip them with the experience and the character to actually respond to the stimuli of British oppression in the way that they do. So Adams thinks that their churches, in addition to their other forms of association, are important. And lastly, I'll again point to Adams. When Adams is called upon to draft a constitution for his home state, Massachusetts, in that 1779 version that Adams writes, he understands religious liberty as being completely consistent with public support of Christianity, and even restrictions on office holders to Protestant Christians, or at least to Christians, he says. The highest offices in the state in that constitution must be professing Christians. And so that is not quite the way we think of religious liberty, but somehow in the well, I'll let Garrett actually comment on that, on how we think of it today. But I think it's worth pointing out that at least for a number of founders, including Adams, it was possible to marry together a firm insistence on the freedom of conscience and the freedom of religion, the freedom of worship, with an insistence on public support for Christianity, which makes its way into public documents from the Declaration of Independence down to the state constitutions.
That was great. That was great, Pavlos. All I would add to that is to put yourself in the mindset of the American founders. It's extraordinarily helpful to be thinking about when they brought forth, this country. The real achievement was how they were able to, as Justice Kennedy would later put it in an opinion, concurring opinion in U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton. I'll just quote from it. Federalism was our nation's own discovery. The framers split the atom of sovereignty. It was the genius of their idea that our citizens would have two political capacities, one state and one federal, each protected from incursion by the other. The resulting Constitution created a legal system unprecedented in form and design, establishing two orders of government, each with its own direct relationship, its own privity, its own set of mutual rights and obligations to the people who sustain it and are governed by it. It's appropriate to recall these origins, which instruct us as to the nature of the two different governments created and confirmed by the Constitution. I bring this up because, remember, the First Amendment makes it very clear that there will be no Church of the United States, but it also existed at a time when each of the states had incorporated churches of their own. It wasn't until 1831 when Massachusetts, the last state to still have an incorporated church, did away with it. To inhabit the minds of the American founders, you have to understand that they lived in a world where, of course, the churches would be able to incorporate in the states, and of course, these churches could have their own views on what the political good life entailed. It's also important to note that when we had this Second Great Awakening, it was happening in the context of kind of falling away from what had been a greater sense of the religiosity in earlier eras. So what I'm trying to get at is that religion at the time of the founding was complicated, for sure. There wasn't as much I guess what you want to call the pluralism that we have today, but there were stark lines that were drawn, and yet it was an immense achievement of the American founders that they were able to bring forth a system of government where the religious wars of Europe were not imported into the United States.
Well, so you're essentially saying, if I may consider this as a layman, is something great happened with headwinds that were because as a Catholic, not that this is not a Catholic cabal here, but just by coincidence it is. I think from our perspective now, as we approach the celebration of the 250th, we think of religious freedom, religious liberty as allowing anyone to do whatever they want. And yet, if you're a Catholic in Maryland, Maryland of all places, Maryland, the home of the Tolerance Act, became a harshly anti-Catholic colony until right before the. So I guess this would be a good time to ask. Well, what is the religious freedom? What is religious liberty? What is free exercise? They may always be three separate things. But Garrett, do you want? I know you just talked about it somewhat, but you want to elaborate on that a little?
Sure. I mean, probably the simplest distillation that still holds up nicely comes from James Madison in his Memorial and Remonstrance. That was, I believe, Pavlos, you can correct me, 1790, in and around then, where he defines religion as basically the duty that we owe to the Creator. And this is an important distinction because when we talk about rights, us, today in the 21st century, as Americans, we screen out almost always, unfortunately, discussion of duties and obligations. But the founders thought of all rights as having concomitant duties and obligations. They were two sides of the same coin. So the idea of religious liberty being a kind of get out of jail free card for any kind of activity or any kind of beliefs detached from what we would understand as the moral limits of anything that can be considered a rights claim would be absurd to the American founders. Religious liberty was bound by the same kind of natural restraints that you would say that for example, if we're going to be on the First Amendment, when we talk about speech, free speech does not entail defamation. Why? Because it's basically taking what is a natural right and abusing it, going beyond the contours of its understanding of having natural limits as well. And so when I, when I'm frequently posed with this question of what is the grounds of our religious liberty, the grounds of the religious liberty are the same kind of grounds that whenever we would necessarily articulate a right. Well, when I approach that religious that when I approach that right to religious liberty, I'm also asking for what are the grounds of reason that would allow us to articulate that right, but also its limits. And what are the duties or the obligations to enforce those limits? Well, that's going to fall to the government, but it's from a presumption of all of us having a presumptive liberty to engage in truth seeking, because religious liberty is as Robbie George might say, it's a basic good all of us retain. But even that, religious liberty, that natural right, that ability to pursue truth, it has limits as well, bounded by the same kind of reasons that whenever we were to articulate a right, that have to be brought forth.
Pavlos and Garrett, we're going to get to American exceptionalism in a bit and see if these dots connect about civil society, exceptionalism, and our founding. I want to raise, though, since we're here in part to talk about the founding and the founders, one of the founders is George Washington. And I want two things about him, talk about him, and then I want to talk about his letter to the Hebrew congregation separately. But how important, Pavlos, to you, how important do you think George Washington, the man, was to America's being a nation that embraced religious liberty or found it integral? Did he really? How important do you believe he held religious liberty to be as a component of what should define America? And then we'll separately, I want to raise the letter to the Hebrew congregations. Your thoughts?
Sure. Well, I think the letters that you're referring to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, maybe another.
Newport, right.
Yeah.
He had several letters, but
yes.
Yeah.
So I think that has to be, in a way, part of the answer. So I'll try to answer it generally, but with that in mind. I think of Washington's farewell address, his letter to the Hebrews. I believe he has a letter to the Quakers as well, articulating a position that insists upon, again, the importance of religion for good politics, for good morals, but does not go so far as to insist upon one version of religion to the exclusion of others. And that seems to be the consensus position among many of the founders. And it's just worth pausing and noting here that we are in the habit of speaking of the founders or the framers as a body, and there is much that they agree on, but there are also 80-20 cases, and maybe some of the things that are best represented by Adams or by others is an 80-20 case among the founders. In other words, you can find Jefferson or even Madison disagreeing with some of these points, right? Jefferson leading the charge for the disestablishment of the church in Virginia. In the case of Washington, the way at least that he deploys his persona and the way that he leads the country as president in that first decade after the Constitution, he uses the pulpit of president. He uses his ethos as the statesman, the father of the country, to insist upon what scholars have called the founder's syllogism, right? So the founder's syllogism, I didn't come up with this term, but I've read it elsewhere, that because morality depends upon religion and good Republican government depends upon morality. Therefore, in a sort of distant way, or a removed way at least, Republican government, the thing that all of the founders affirm, depends in some way upon religion. And so where do we go from there? Do we go all the way to saying with John Adams that the state ought to fund with taxpayer dollars, if necessary, ministers, as Adams insists in the Massachusetts Constitution? Or do we instead say, we would like to have a society in which religion is flourishing? Religious liberty is, of course, an ingredient to that, and maybe even a sufficient condition for that. There's a range of opinions there, and Washington at least insists upon the necessity of religion and morality for our project. And by his example in reaching out to religious minorities such as the Hebrew congregation or the Quakers, he shows that this vision of the central importance of religion and morality to America can be a tolerant vision, at least within certain bounds.
Well, do you think it's more than tolerant? Just take the letter. So
Sure.
here, the letter to the Hebrew congregations, which George Washington wrote in 1790 to the Touro Synagogue. And I
Mhm.
assume most of our people who are participating here have seen this, but he talked of the stock of Abraham, which is very, to me, a noble use of language.
Mhm.
Quote, to continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants while everyone shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. I think this has important relevance to America now in 2025, but it says something to me more than tolerance. It almost to me expresses what we might think is the ideal of America, that it should be a place where people can, and it's through faith. It's not through commerce here, it's through faith where we can worship and none shall make us afraid. It's a beautiful image, sitting under the fig tree, etc. Are we talking about more than tolerance here, or maybe we are?
Um, your point is well taken. I think, I guess one of the reasons I use the language of tolerance is that I don't think Washington would recommend that we need to avoid affirming public Christianity.
Right.
I don't think he would go that far in the direction in that direction. I'm also not confident that Washington would apply affirmation of other faiths to radically different faiths,
Okay.
to ones that do not trace their lineage back to Abraham, to use the language from here. And so I'm hesitant to say it is full affirmation of every faith without distinction. It does seem like the Jewish Americans have a special place insofar as they are linked to Christians, who are the overwhelming majority of Americans, and in a certain way the key to our founding, that other faiths could not claim. And so
Right.
again, when you cite the prophets, that is the kind of text that is a ground for a conversation and a commonality between Jews and Christians in a way in which it might not be with people of radically different faiths.
We're talking about the founding in broad terms, not just
Yep.
1776, where we go through to the Constitutional Convention and the Bill of Rights, First Amendment. So, Garrett, I'm just your view of debate at the time. I think, Garrett, I think you may have the Federalist Papers at your bedside. I'm making an assumption
Well,
here.
my boss Hadley Arcus, who I owe my pretty much my whole professional career, expected me when I had my firstborn to have had him already quoting from the Federalist Papers by the age of 1. So I think that actually would require me to keep it by my bedside. So it would be bedtime reading.
Well, what's your
Oh,
assessment of the great creators of this country through the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, etc.? Uh, how did they prioritize religious liberty, religious freedom? How vital did they find it? I mean, it's in the First Amendment. It's not the Third Amendment. It's not the
right. I mean, I'm with Harry Jaffa on this one, insofar as that I think that religious liberty was one of the cornerstone achievements of the founding generation, and I think it was important that the First Amendment prioritizes religious liberty before like civil liberties, because if you don't disestablish religion and like exclude sectarian disputes from politics, this the regime of, as Lincoln kept insisting, that core of the Declaration's promise that was of fundamental equality. That was the apple of gold around which the Constitution was the frame of silver, and we oftentimes forget that the apple was made for the frame. Sorry, the frame was made for the apple, not the apple for the frame. We still have at our core the Declaration's promise. This was, I mean, it was simply put like revolutionary. And
Right.
Jaffa in his writings, this is why he referred to America as not just exceptional, but the American founding gave us what he called the best regime, and a large part of it was because it treated religion as or at least like the theological ends of man, or the pursuits of man, were matters for conscience, while public life relied on, and this is, I guess, getting to the toleration discussion. Like, we had to agree, not just tolerate. We had to all abide by our fundamental equality by appealing to universal moral truths. Right? The divine, as Aquinas said, the divine law we know through revelation, but the natural law we know through that reason that is accessible to all human beings. And so, the founders, this wasn't 80-20. This was 100%. Jefferson, right. Madison, Washington, Hamilton, they understood their project as bridging like reason and revelation. And this would create something like, the comity or civic friendship. That was something that, again, it wasn't just a creature of happenstance. Like this, that was the only way this country was going to solve the issues that had been plaguing Europe for centuries. Right. I'll leave it there, because I'm sure.
Well, before we get on to American exceptionalism, then, Pablo, so we have a question from Lino. Was the idea of the founders that each state would profess largely homogeneous faith in a particular flavor of Christianity? Is that your understanding?
I take it, and Garrett can correct me if I'm wrong on this, I take it part of the motive for the First Amendment was to preserve the state's abilities to do exactly that if they so chose. I'm not, so that's a qualified yes to that question. I'm not sure the founders all got together and said, it would be great if we had this arrangement where Massachusetts was Congregationalist, and another state was more Episcopalian, another state was more Quaker, like that they planned it out in that way. But given the situation in the 1770s and 80s, there were different religious characters in different states. There were established churches in different colonies, now states, and they knew they could not come together unless they had a guarantee against the threat of a nationwide established church threatening the state establishments. So yeah, at least continue to allow that diversity of establishments and religious characters in different states to endure.
Completely agree. The pithy way I would describe it is, the First Amendment was created to protect religious freedom by limiting government's power over religion. Like, we hear, though, the opposite constantly in our day, that no, the First Amendment is to protect government from a Christo-fascist theocratic cabal from taking it over. That's not what the founders thought. The founders did not want to have the churches be co-opted or tempted by a national government. They had learned their 16th century history. This was for them a core feature of how the First Amendment was shaped.
I want to move back to the founders at the end if we have time, because I want to get to John Adams' statement about the moral and religious people. But before again, I promise we're going to talk about American exceptionalism. Just quickly, Ken asks, can you address Jefferson's strain of Christianity, his Bible without miracles, for example? Do either of you want to say anything about Thomas Jefferson, the man, and the role he played vis-a-vis religion, religious liberty?
All you, Pablos.
Pablos,
I'll just very briefly note, I don't think I'm an expert on this, but I'll briefly note that it's my sense that his most radical modern sounding secular statements are also his most private. And so while Jefferson, the man, seems to be at what you might call the left edge of the American founding, maybe Thomas Paine is then like another mile after him, but he's pretty far out there in terms of where the median is on a number of issues, on sympathy to the French Revolution when it breaks out, and on the desire for a more democratic version of our regime. So also with Christianity and religion, he's I think at the edge, the more liberal edge of the consensus. And so that comes out most clearly in his private correspondence. He's much more restrained and affirming, and I think genuinely affirming, at least the utility of religion for politics and for the kind of politics that he favors of Republican self-government. And so even Jefferson, though his own religion is quite heterodox by our standards and by the standards of his own time, even Jefferson goes further than many conservatives today would in affirming the utility of public Christianity.
I want to urge our folks who are watching this to visit the Center for Civil Society's website, centerforcivilsociety.org, and you find events and click on events, and you will see a link to a very important conference we're having, America 250 conference. It's titled Civil Society and America at 250, The Past and Future of What Has Made America Exceptional. It takes place in Philadelphia, November 5th, 6th. Check out the agenda, check out the speakers. I know you're going to love it, and I think you should join us. So please do that. Speaking of American exceptionalism, here's a mouthful. Tocqueville finds the breadth and depth of voluntary associations. Quote, Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all minds constantly unite together. He finds that the thing which most distinguishes America, at least in comparison to citizens of England and France. And he writes again, to my mind, there is nothing that merits the attention more than the intellectual and moral associations of America. That's quite a pronouncement. And I'd say he is saying that is what makes America exceptional. So let's discuss American exceptionalism, which Barack Obama did a few years ago when he says America's exceptional, just like Greece is exceptional. Like maybe even said just like Kenya's exceptional. I'm not sure if he said that. But is there such a thing, recognizable and definable, even loosely, and relatable? Is there such a thing as American exceptionalism? And to the point of this webinar, and unless I'm misreading Tocqueville, is it that America has such a vibrant civil society that almost instinctively desires to create associations? Is that what we mean rightly by American exceptionalism? And if that's not what American exceptionalism is, what is it, if there is one even? So how about Garrett, let me start with you. Your thoughts on that.
When I hear the question of what makes America exceptional, I'm these days I'm hearing the right in particular revisit sort of debates that we've had for a very long time, but I'm hearing the right walk away from discussions that walk away from the I think the the abstract truth applicable to all men at all times. This is that fundamental truth that I was discussing moments ago, of all of us having equality as a natural feature. Now that doesn't mean, of course, natural attributes are all equal. This is an understanding of equality as being really rooted in that Judeo-Christian understanding of equality before God, equality before our Maker. And that still is what at core makes America the most exceptional or the most unique. We were the first country founded on this proposition. But of course, it's not the only thing that makes us unique. Our history, of course, our unique features and attributes, which are a blend of the Anglo tradition mixed with all of the different populations which emerged at the founding and have since. American exceptionalism is uniquely borne out though, as you were saying, Jack, in Tocqueville's observations, because what Tocqueville was observing was something wholly unlike what he had experienced in his travels throughout Europe or elsewhere. Just so our listeners know, if they don't know already, like Tocqueville traveled all over. I mean, you can read Tocqueville's writings about traveling in Egypt, the Levant. Like Tocqueville went all over, and it was his in his writings on America where he encountered a society, one generation or so removed from the actual founding, that was functional on their own, but it didn't have what were the formal governmental structures that really gave rise to civic life in, for example, France, the Holy Roman Empire. Like these were, for the most part, self-functioning little platoons, little towns where the courthouse was often the most important building. Lawyers, in particular, in the early eras of the founding, and then the generation that Tocqueville was writing in, lawyers had an outsized role, and what he referred to as being Republican schoolmasters, teaching their fellow citizens how to constitute themselves, how to self-govern. That's why in Europe, lawyers, they don't have the same kind of kind of like civic callings that they do in the United States. Now, I know, here I am as a lawyer trying to probably give the best construction of lawyers. Meanwhile, everybody listening is rolling their eyes. But go back and read Democracy in America, and you will see Tocqueville writing with such admiration for lawyers and for judges as helping civic society function, because they were taking on this kind of tutelary role in allowing these little towns and societies to help function, because that's what it requires. The United States, especially in those early eras, required a tremendous amount of sacrifice from people who wore, simply put, a lot of different hats.
Yeah. By the way, I think Rick Brookhiser has been able to join us, and Rick, if you're there, I appreciate it. You may have cleared out a purgatory in your efforts to join us here.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Can indeed.
Okay.
I'm going to ask.
I'm here like Caesar Rodney at the last minute.
That's yes, but he was from the first state, so there you go. Rick, I'll ask you a question in a second, but we were just talking about what's American exceptionalism, referring to Tocqueville's observations, and let you think about that a second. Well, Pavlos, do you want your reflections
Sure.
on Tocqueville's views, and is American exceptionalism something that is reflective of the robust civil society and voluntary associations that he saw when he came to America?
Yes, absolutely. And I like Tocqueville's identification of the art of associating as the thing that distinguishes America. I think that is a correct reading of Tocqueville, and I think Tocqueville has a correct reading of America. And so just to say a little bit about that, we see this in the founding and in the colonial period, and in how the colonial period informs the founding. And so whether you look at direct historical studies, whether you look at testimonies from people like John Adams, again, in that letter to the Abbé de Mably, explaining the genius of the American Revolution, it's the fact that Americans are associating religiously and civically and politically that gives them the institutions and the practice as citizens of deliberating together, of organizing, of working. The Declaration of Independence is inconceivable without a people who are habituated to doing the very boring work of forming committees and coming up with Robert's Rules of Order or whatever the equivalent is at that time, right? When you contrast something like the Declaration of Independence with the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen that comes out of the French Revolution, the drafting of the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen is a giant crowd yelling out things that sound good and then shouting them up or shouting them down. And that's why that document is frankly not as elegant as the American Declaration of Independence. By contrast, we can't even get to the point of Jefferson and Adams and Franklin and the others being appointed to a committee to work on a Declaration of Independence without over a century of Americans associating with one another on a local level, on a state level, then on an increasingly continental level in the 1760s and 70s,
Right.
and then going through, again, all of the dry processes of let's have regular order in our deliberations. Let's form a committee to take this task and then bring it back to the whole body. You can't even get that beautiful document without that kind of habit of associating that runs through our social life, our religious life, in forming churches and ministers, and our properly political life. Where does that come from? That's then a question.
Right.
Why is it that the Americans have this to a greater degree than other peoples? I think if we're still following Tocqueville, his preferred term is the Anglo-Americans. He thinks it's something about the English heritage. He speaks about the different populations in America, and he designates the bulk population, the leading population of the United States of America, as Anglo-Americans. I think that's a very revealing designation, and I think that's a trail to follow in seeing where does this come from. It seems like the English have been doing this for some time before some of them come and settle in America. So presumably part of that comes from our dominant English heritage at the time of the founding.
Well, I want to get Rick involved here and then move backwards to then move to the future, which sounds like some movie with Michael J. Fox in it. But Rick, because I want to get to John Adams, and Rick, you've written a book about the Adamses, the first dynasty. But if you don't mind, not quickly, take as long as you want. We were reflecting on what is American exceptionalism, looking at Tocqueville's views, and I'm being prejudiced here, loading it into the robust civil society, voluntary associations that he saw when he came to America. Rick, do you have any views? Like, what is there American exceptionalism? And we're going to take Obama and all that out of there. We're not going to look at how we're talking about it in the 2020s. Do you think there is something that is exceptional about America? And if you do, what is it? And then I'm going to ask you about the Adamses.
Well, we're talking about Tocqueville, and he's one of many Frenchmen who were very taken with what was going on in America. And you always have to see what they were dealing with at home. It was an absolutist monarchy until very shortly before the French Revolution. There were some changes being made even before 1789, but just at the last minute. And then after the Revolution, and then after Napoleon, and then with the Restoration, there was a constitution when the Bourbons came back. Louis XVIII granted one, but it was very limited, and also everything focused on Paris. I mean, France was a big country; it was a very populous country, but Paris and/or Versailles had just been the center of everything for so long. That just wasn't true in the 13 colonies. It was said that before the Revolution, people in different colonies, they each had more to do with England, if they had anything to do with anybody outside their colony, than they did with their neighboring colonies, which was true. I mean, the Stamp Act is the first time they mostly get together, and that's 1765, and then they start, having continental congresses, and then there's a continental army. But it's still a very spread out country, and then it's also a country where every colony had at least one elected branch of the colonial government, usually a lower house. 2 colonies elected everything, including the governors. Those were Connecticut and Rhode Island, but that was only 2 out of 13. But so even in colonies that just had the one house, there were people, and the franchise wasn't huge, but there were people who had experience of, having a legislature and who gets to sit in it, and they fought over it, and there was politics and at the local level in each of these colonies, different factions and families fighting it out, and then doing things. So there was experience that as Pavlos was just saying, the French lacked. and we fortunately had.
Rick, if we can go back to John Adams and his famous quote, because I want to follow it up if we believe it's true or if it's a mirror to what's happening today. And that famous quote is our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Do you have any thoughts you want to share about John Adams as one of the founders? And as we're talking today, the topics related to religious liberty and his views, but any views then on that particular assessment of him about America? Was it a throwaway line, or was it the core of what he truly believed of the Republic?
Well, look, John Adams is a very pungent guy, and I think he did believe that. What was his influence on his fellow Americans? It waxed and waned. It was probably the most influential thing he did was he wrote a book in defense of a non-unitary government. He said that the new state governments, which were kind of modeled on the old colonial governments, they had an executive and they had divided legislatures. And there were some people who wanted unitary legislatures. Pennsylvania had one at first. They had a one-house legislature. And Adams thought that was a bad idea, and he thought it was a bad idea in France, which is how they started out after 1789. And he wrote a book which he wasn't at the Constitutional Convention, but probably a number of those delegates had read it and absorbed the argument, and it was a reflection of what existed anyway, but it sort of reminded people and firmed them up. As far as Americans being moral and religious, well, they all, deists included, I think they all signed on with that. You can find a few people at that time who were anti-religious. I mean, Ethan Allen was one. The most famous was Paine. Sort of later in his career, I mean, when he's writing The American Crisis, he's quoting the Bible, but he only becomes Tom Paine, the great anti-Christian, a little later on, and of course that destroyed his reputation. Here, he attacked George Washington and Jesus, and that was a bad pair of people to attack. But the other ones, I mean, even Jefferson. There's a book by Thomas Kidd, interesting author, and he argues that Jefferson did become a Unitarian sort of early in the 19th century. But even before that, Jefferson puts in the Declaration of Independence laws of nature and nature's God, and endowed by our Creator. And did he do this because he himself was pious? Well, no. I'm sure he's a good politician, so he recognized that most people were. But he's also putting that in there to say that these rights that we're discussing, they're not my idea.
Right.
These aren't Thomas Jefferson's little thoughts. These aren't the Continental Congress's thoughts. These are not being offered or given you by any human agency. You have those, we have those because of who and what we are. Our Creator, this is how we are made. And
Right.
it can be destroyed. It can be denied. Tyrants can withhold them and trample them. But you can never say that we shouldn't enjoy them. When we don't, it's always unjust.
I'm going to squeeze every last drop I can out of you. We have 10 minutes left, and I want to conclude this with thoughts from the three of you, and maybe if we sneak something in there on Garrett about the tension on First Amendment tension, but about John Adams' comment and how does that stand up today? But Rick, you've created, you're the brains behind this wonderful documentary. Folks can see it on PBS. It's called Free Exercise. I think you have about eight stories related to the fight for religious freedom or free
Right.
worship. And we began. One of them was, of course, the first one in the documentary is the Flushing Remonstrance, which was about a century before Declaration of Independence was declared. I don't want to pick on that, but I will pick on that. And briefly, if you can tell us, like, why was that worth being in your documentary, and is it still important to America today in some cultural or legal way?
The Flushing Remonstrance was a remonstrance, or really a protest, that was sent to Peter Stuyvesant. This was New Amsterdam. This is before the Brits take it from the Dutch. And Peter Stuyvesant, he was an effective director general in a lot of ways, but he was also a bigot and a tyrant. And he just thought, Calvinism was the only right way, and he really tried to lean on whoever wasn't. If he got his chain yanked by his bosses back in Amsterdam, he would back off. But, he didn't like Jews, he didn't like Lutherans, then he didn't like Quakers. And he was really landed hard on Quakers because they had no defenders back in Holland. They were brand new religion, and very, very odd and off-putting to Orthodox people. And he jailed them, and he beat this one guy, and he kicked other people out of the colony. And then he said, okay, no more Quakers here at all. Nobody lets them in. If anybody harbors them, if you let them in your house, that is an offense. You will suffer for it. So these 32 men in Flushing, which was a little village where it now is on the western end of Long Island, they sent him this remonstrance, and they said, we cannot obey this because God tells us to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And so these men were telling Peter Stuyvesant, look, we're not challenging your authority really, but in this case you have told us something that we cannot do. And what is so impressive to me about this is, first, this is not a statement by a wise ruler, right? I mean, this isn't James Madison putting the First Amendment in the Constitution. It's not William Penn setting up a colony where everybody can worship. These are ordinary people protesting against what their government has done. And then the second thing is this is not a philosophical argument. It's not James Madison saying that, well, when you have a lot of religions, that's good because they'll all keep watch on each other, and, it's part of the great mix that keeps everything stable. They're saying, no, we're doing this because God tells us to do this. And then the thing that moved me so much is when these guys signed the document, and we saw the actual thing in Albany. They've got the first copy that was made for Stuyvesant when it was handed to him. 6 of them couldn't sign their names. They made marks, and then the clerk said who these people were. They could not sign their names, but they made their mark. They laid down a marker, and I just find that combination so moving.
Terrific. Folks, again, check it out. There's a link here in the chat, free exercise. Garrett, I want to ask you a quick question, and then we'll end with your thoughts on reflections on Adam's statement. Garrett, what is the big religious liberty fight going on in the courts today that should be of concern to us? Is it still nuns trying to be forced IUDs on religious little old Catholic nuns, or are there more important and telling fights going on?
Well, so the fights right now over the First Amendment can probably be split into the two main clauses, right? For religion, free exercise, and then establishment. What all non-lawyers listening should know is that there have been multiple victories on the establishment clause front that have restored the founders' understanding of, or at least come a lot closer to overturning precedents, from the post-war period, through probably as recently as like 10, 15 years ago. it owes a tremendous amount of credit to groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, First Liberty Institute, Beckett, for their fantastic work. There continue to be challenges, but largely the momentum with at least this six Republican appointed justice majority seems to be strongly moving towards restoring the founders' understanding on the Establishment Clause, and there will be successive cases continuing to pick and choose arenas where that will be further highlighted, be it crucifixes in classrooms, the 10 Commandments on public grounds. We're going to start to see rulings, I think, to allow those. Now on free exercise, it's a little bit more complicated. The justices have absolutely been at loggerheads with one another, including even among the six Republican appointed justice majority, about what to do with the vexing 1990 opinion from Justice Scalia, Employment Divisions of Oregon versus Smith. That's a precedent that most in the conservative legal movement don't like. I actually think that it's a precedent that can be redeemed, but that puts me more in the minority. But it's a fight that the justices are not particularly eager to wade into, although they are doing so possibly in modest ways in this upcoming term. But once again, it all depends on how the Republican appointed justices are seeking to make either incremental change or only or wholesale change. I think on the Establishment Clause front, you're going to see incremental but meaningful change. I'm not quite certain on the free exercise front. You're going to see too much change too quickly.
Well, we have 2 minutes left, and Pablo, so I'm going to have to give you the last word for everybody. So here's the mouthful. As we approach the 250th, we're a nation of declining religiosity, declining civil society, if one uses the gauge of participation in voluntary associations as a measure. We're also a nation of declining demographics as relates to fertility, something again seemingly related to religious practice and church attendance. Even though we may enjoy religious liberty, is it fair to say, as goes worship, so goes civil society, so goes America? In other words, was John Adams right about America being a successful thing as long as it had a moral and religious people?
I never want to disagree with John Adams, even though I fear the consequences of agreeing with him in this case because of how we complete the syllogism if our Constitution is inadequate to the governance of a non-religious, non-moral people.
Right.
So I fear to go in that direction, and yet I'm tempted to follow him there. So two very brief points. One is that it makes sense to me that family formation, religiosity, and patriotism would stand and fall together. Each of these is an instance of devotion, gratitude, what Thomas Aquinas would call the virtue of piety. Yeah, piety even towards parents and country. That's the way he uses that term. But it's gratitude, the attempt to pay back an unpaybackable debt to something that you are infinitely indebted to, your country, your family, your parents, and especially to God. So there's a certain logic to me that these things would rise and fall together and be mutually dependent upon one another. However the lines of causation work, that they are knitted together in some way. Regarding Adams's letter in particular, I'll just point out that the context for that is he's contrasting the American character with the French. And it's not to beat up on the French, but this is 1798 when he writes this letter to the militia in which he makes this comment. And it's clear that he is looking across the pond at the French Revolution, the loss of honor, of honesty, of morality, of religion in the Reign of Terror and afterwards, and saying that a people who act in this way and who have this kind of understanding can't be governed by the American Constitution. One warning sign to me is how typical it is for Americans to think of the American Revolution and the French Revolution as similar in spirit. Conservatives, intellectuals rarely make this mistake, but it's a very popular thing to think of the age of revolutions. We're all working for freedom and liberty and so on. So maybe the French did it a little bit wrong, but they're fundamentally working towards the same purpose. If we're not able to distinguish the American Revolution from the French Revolution, from 1848, from the Russian Revolution, from all of these other struggles for liberation, then we really are in a bad way by Adams's perspective.
Well, Pavlos Papadopoulos, Garrett Snedeker, Rick Brook-Kaiser, and my colleagues Celia and Caitlin, thank you for all the work you put in. Gentlemen, thank you for the wisdom you shared. Folks who are watching, thank you. It'll be up on the Center for Civil Society's YouTube channel soon, and we'll be back again with another webinar on America 250 soon. To check out the Center for Civil Society website for that. And I want to thank you again very much for all the wisdom you shared. Folks, God bless. Have a good day.